You know, we use Ruby every day, right? And we rely on it behaving consistently.
Yeah, absolutely.
But have you ever stopped to think about how that consistency is actually uh, defined?
It's a great question. It's not just magic, is it?
No, not at all. It's largely thanks to this project called RubySpec.
Ah, yes. Ruby spec.
Think of it like the ultimate blueprint, maybe?
Yeah.
Super detailed for the Ruby language.
Way beyond typical documentation,
Huh.
yeah. It gets into the nitty-gritty of how every single part should work.
Exactly. So for you listening, if you want to really get Ruby quickly, understand its core.
Without reading, like, endless manuals.
This deep dive is kind of your express lane.
Right. We're looking at how Ruby itself is defined through this spec.
And our mission today really is to figure out who the key players are, who's crafting this thing.
And why does it even matter? That's the crucial part.
Totally. We've got this really interesting blog post that actually digs into the contribution data for RubySpec.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Where did this even start? This idea of having such a strict specification for Ruby?
Well, what's fascinating, and maybe a bit surprising, is that Ruby spec, it was originally called Ruby spec, by the way. It didn't actually start with CRuby, you know, the main Ruby implementation most people use.
Oh, really?
Yeah, back in 2006, it was the Rubinius project.
Rubinius, okay.
They were the ones who first really saw the need for this kind of precise definition.
So they started writing these specs.
Exactly. And initially, the specs were just part of the Rubinius codebase itself.
Huh. So they were defining how their implementation should behave, essentially.
Pretty much defining the standard for themselves first.
So it sounds like Rubinius was really the pioneer here, defining Ruby formally in those early years.
Absolutely. The blog post makes it clear they were the main contributor right up until about 2014.
Wow. Okay, so nearly a decade of leading the charge.
Yeah, they were instrumental in just getting the whole thing off the ground, setting that foundation.
But the post also mentions things changed around 2015.
Right. The pace of development on Rubinius itself kind of slowed down then. And, well, naturally, their contributions to the spec project also started to decrease.
Which makes sense, but this is where it gets really interesting, doesn't it? Because as Rubinius eased off...
Someone else jumped in.
Big time.
Yeah. The blog post points to TruffleRuby emerging in 2014 as this, like, major turning point.
Absolutely. TruffleRuby, right from the get-go, clearly understood how valuable this precise spec was.
So they picked up the mantle, so to speak.
You could say that. Since 2014, they've become the dominant contributor. We're talking over half of all the commits to RubySpec.
Over half. That's huge.
It really is. It just underlines their commitment to making sure their implementation follows a really strict standard.
It also maybe suggests something about newer implementations, right? Sometimes they take this specification part even more seriously from the start.
That's a great point. It can definitely influence things, maybe even push the core implementation.
Okay, but what about CRuby? You know, the original, the one most people are using daily. Where do they fit in?
CRuby's role is pretty interesting. They've been consistent. Consistent how?
Well, the analysis shows they contribute around 20% of the commits, pretty steadily year after year.
Okay, 20%. That's still significant.
It is, and you have to remember CRuby's unique position.
What's that?
They're usually the first ones to actually implement new Ruby language features.
Ah, right. They're defining the behavior initially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when they contribute to RubySpec, it's often reflecting the intended direction of the language itself. It's particularly valuable input.
That makes perfect sense. They set the standard, RubySpec documents it precisely.
Sort of captures it, yeah.
Now, the blog post also mentioned JRuby. They were involved too.
Yes, definitely. Especially in the early days. JRuby played a really crucial role before about 2012.
Making substantial contributions back then.
For sure. Their activity has lessened since then, but their early work was absolutely vital in shaping the spec's initial form.
Got it. And it's not just the sort of big 3 or big 4 implementations, is it? Natalie gets a mention too.
Indeed. Natalie's newer started around 2019.
And they're contributing now.
Yeah, there's been a noticeable uptick in their contributions, especially since 2022. The post actually calls out one contributor at Herwin for doing significant work there.
That's cool. It shows newer players also see how important this is.
Right, for the health of the whole ecosystem.
This really paints a picture of like a whole community effort. It's not just the core teams.
No, absolutely not. And the blog post really stresses this point about external contributors.
People not tied to a specific implementation.
Exactly. Individuals.
Yeah.
Their ongoing involvement is crucial for making the spec robust and comprehensive.
And there was a big surge at one point.
Yeah, a huge spike, as the post calls it, back in 2009.
Wow. Why?
Largely down to one person, at RunPaint. They did a massive amount of work migrating old specs and adding tons of new ones.
Incredible. That really shows community dedication.
It really does, just ensuring Ruby is defined accurately.
It's interesting, though, that the post mentions how they actually tracked this data. Sounds like there were some quirks.
Yeah, a little bit. Comes down to the GitHub API they used.
Limitations.
Right. It limits really detailed stats to the top 100 contributors.
Ah. So some external contributions might be slightly undercounted?
Potentially, yeah.
Hmm.
Especially from folks who contribute less frequently. The numbers might be a tiny bit off there.
And how did they decide who belonged to which implementation?
They looked at the top 100 contributors overall. And if someone made at least 10 commits to a specific Ruby implementation's own repository, they were classified as being associated with that implementation for the Ruby spec analysis.
Oh, okay, so it's a specific methodology.
Yeah, and they acknowledge, look, commit count isn't a perfect measure of impact, but...
It's the data you have available.
Yeah, exactly. It's the most consistent data point they could work with.
And apparently there are other charts, too, looking at people with even more commits, like over 100.
Yeah, different ways to slice the data. But the main takeaway, regardless of the exact numbers...
is that Ruby spec is this big collaborative thing, lots of different players.
Precisely. So let's get to the core of it. Why should someone listening, someone using Ruby every day, actually care about all this effort going into Ruby spec?
Yeah, what's the payoff for us developers?
Well, the blog post really hits this hard. Ruby spec is absolutely fundamental.
Fundamental for what?
For implementing Ruby correctly and efficiently across different platforms, different versions.
So it helps ensure that Ruby code I write runs the same way on CRuby versus, say, TruffleRuby.
That's the goal. It provides a much more detailed, granular definition of how Ruby should behave than, like, standard documentation ever could.
It's like the ultimate test suite for Ruby itself.
A litmus test for compliance, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
And the evidence is there, right? The post mentioned finding hundreds of issues in CRuby because of writing these specs.
That's just staggering, isn't it? Hundreds of bugs or inconsistencies found in the main implementation.
Just by the act of trying to define the behavior rigorously?
Exactly. It shows how vital this spec is for ensuring the reliability and correctness of the language we all use. It's a safety net.
And the author had an interesting idea about why Ruby spec is so good at finding these problems, comparing it to CRuby's own tests.
Yeah, that was insightful. They talked about the structure.
The structure of the specs themselves.
Right. The use of nested describe blocks. The author felt this structure naturally encourages more thorough testing.
How so?
It kind of pushes you to explore more combinations of arguments, more edge cases in a systematic way.
Okay.
They contrasted that with CRuby's unit tests, which apparently often have fewer checks within a single test method.
And maybe less descriptive text about what's being tested?
That too, yeah. The idea is that the Ruby spec structure itself promotes a more exhaustive look at Ruby's details.
Interesting. They mentioned maybe comparing specs and tests directly in the future.
Yeah, looking at random methods, that would be fascinating to see.
So basically, Ruby spec acts like this super detailed, well-organized checklist for anyone building or maintaining a Ruby.
Exactly that. It creates a shared, unambiguous understanding of how Ruby is supposed to work.
Which leads to better compatibility, consistency.
Across all the different Rubies out there. Which ultimately helps everyone who uses the language, no matter which version they prefer.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive really drives home that the stability and consistency we take for granted in Ruby,
it rests on this amazing collaborative effort behind Ruby spec.
It's not just one group, but this diverse mix of implementations and individuals.
All working together to define Ruby's core behavior.
Yeah, understanding who contributes really gives you a deeper appreciation for that hidden work, doesn't it?
It really does. The work that ensures Ruby works predictably and reliably wherever you use it.
This has been really fascinating, digging into the engine room of Ruby like this.
Yeah, it highlights the foundations we build on.
Definitely makes you appreciate it more. So for you, our listener, here's something to chew on. How does having a spec this rigorous, this collaboratively built?
How does that impact not just Ruby, but maybe programming languages more broadly?
Right. What are the wider implications of this kind of community-driven standardization for the future of software development?
That's a big question. Definitely something interesting to think about.